Pressure up. Check. Full charge. Check. Wind direction? A little toward me. I just have to let him get a little closer. Alright, it's showtime starting now!
Original anime is somewhat of a rarity nowadays, and don't get me wrong, the prospects of seeing incredible creatives get material and giving it new life in ways that wasn't possible before is always exciting. But what's even more exciting is seeing those creatives make something completely their own, outside of the current trends not having to compromise their vision, usually giving us very distinct characters and unique takes on genres we would have never seen before, like Habaneri of the Iron Fortress. Taking place during the time of the samurai on the precipice of the Industrial Revolution, a mysterious virus has appeared infecting the inhabitants, turning them into Kabaneri. Now 20 years later, the world has changed with most of the humans living in armored up trains on the constant move away from the threat. Zombie survival stories aren't anything new nowadays, and it's definitely an oversaturated genre, usually having survivors moving from one shelter to another with the main enemy being other groups doing the same. And don't get me wrong, I've thoroughly enjoyed the media it has to offer, but usually the actual zombies are just set dressing to stories about the humans at their limits. It's actually pretty hard to innovate the setup, which might be the reason why they're so rare in anime. There are a few, but even then, the most interesting ones aren't your typical zombie stories. What sets Kabaneri apart is how much the Kabaneri bring to the show. They may look like your run-of-the-mill infected, but have super strength and hearts encaged in steel, making them a legit force to be reckoned with. The virus appearing on the brink of the Industrial Revolution made it that instead of focusing on advancing this newfound technology, the focus became using this technology to fight them, putting the world in this interesting half-step, giving us the steampunk-infused Edo period. Which is a match made in heaven for me since it's one of my favorite settings. It's a much simpler time, but that simplicity equals a lot more personality in the music and especially visually, in the clothes and structures. Anytime I see a series tackle it or at least incorporate elements from it, you're gonna get brownie points from me. Speaking of structures, unlike other zombie stories where the world has fallen and it's empty wastelands, here the world is still thriving, having different societies that have actually adapted to the threat, creating these unique armored up cities. When one of them goes to hell, Ikuma, a young steamsmith, gets bitten while trying out his new weapon and through very extreme methods stops the virus from spreading, turning him into a Kabaneri, a human Kabane hybrid. The last surviving members of the city have all taken shelter in the train, and amidst the chaos he meets Mume, another Kabaneri, giving us the titular Kabaneri of the Iron Fortress, truly kicking off the show. Even though they made it unsafe, they're not out of danger because of the train itself. Being on a constantly moving vehicle seems like a good idea in concept since they're always moving away from the threat, but that also means you can accidentally find them at any moment, making you now trapped with them. While the train is armored up, it can still take damage that can actually affect how it functions, creating another element of tension, since a single malfunctioning part can be what decided life or death for everyone on board. And you have to remember that these are all things the characters have to deal with while the train is moving, and usually at the same time unrelated to each other, giving the show a consistent level of chaos. A fight can be taking place, but that fight won't matter unless they fix what's wrong with the train, also making it that every character has time to shine even if they're not a fighter. And that's one of the cool things about Kabaneri, how everything in it feels like it needs the Kabane to happen. I can't think of another anime where the setup is so closely rooted to the world in the way it's done here, creating this fun risk-reward dynamic that always keeps things interesting. Do you take the slower route with safety guaranteed but at the risk that part of the train won't make it to the next destination, or do you take a much faster route with tons of Kabane? With the train being low on resources, it isn't a simple answer. Taking the slower route could potentially give another train a chance to get there first, meaning that by the time you get there, there still won't be enough to replenish what you're missing. Taking the faster route, while much more dangerous, you're putting everything at risk with the possibility of a bigger reward. These are the decisions that always keep it enthralling, and a lot of these have to be made in the moment since the train is constantly moving. And because of this, they can't take them back, so it's something they'll immediately see the effects of and have to live with. The anime can be very brutal, really letting you see everything that happens to the people, and it keeps death short and simple so you can really see a human in their final moments, and it's very intense. Death itself is ironically one of the hardest things to nail when it comes to zombie survival narratives because the dread of someone actually dying never feels like a genuine concern to me. Death is just used for emotional impact in these stories, having very little effect on everything else. Usually because the cast of characters is always expanding, being expendable additions so that the core group doesn't get affected, just being used for shock value. And even when a more established character does die, the most we're ever losing is just firepower. So the weight of that has to hit home. The thing is, that is all dependent on the viewer. If they were never that interested in them, the whole reason for killing them off becomes pointless. That's not the case here, since the setup keeps the cast very small, with each one having their own role that keeps the train moving. And they're aware of that themselves, so there's a much bigger reliance on each other than in most other anime, and usually it leads to some pretty great moments between them.
Sakari, can you hear me?
What's up?
There's something jammed along the variable axis and the pressure's not going up. Go fix it.
Seriously? But that's on the other side of the connecting shaft, isn't it?
You got it.
Touch it even a little and it might rip your arm off. Good luck.
Huh? But
This is why the Kabaneri feel like a real threat, because someone dying can disrupt how everything functions. Speaking of the inhabitants of the train, each one of them has an incredibly strong sense of identity due to how well it's presented visually, primarily with the design of the cast being done by the legendary Haruhiko Mikomoto, the guy behind the original Macross, Mobile Suit Gundam 0080 War in the Pocket, and Gunbusters. And even if you haven't seen these, you'll still recognize his work with the watercolor paintings so prominent with the Gundam franchise over the decades. Or if you're a Nintendo/Zelda fan, you may recognize the illustrations he did for the original Legend of Zelda, which are some of my favorites of his. He was primarily active in the 1980s and is one of the reasons sci-fi and mecha anime from the era have such a distinct look that wasn't replicated afterwards. Kabaneri is his first character design work in over 2 decades, and I like that his style hasn't changed since then. Its looks always reminded me of anime from the 80s, which makes sense, but it gives it a subtle visual flair that really stands out in the modern landscape. He may have enjoyed working on Kabaneri because it looks like he's going to be doing more stuff in the future since he's working on the upcoming Gundam Hathaway Flash trilogy, and that's really exciting. The Edo steampunk setting really made this his playground to create colorful, distinct styles that all still meld together. A quick glance at any of the cast can give you an idea of who they are and their relationship to the world because of the amount of thought put into them. The show is eye candy, but with lots of substance rather than just being style, and that's not only for the character designs but for the action as well. With Studio being at the helm, was able to translate his original concepts to the final product beautifully, and the animation on display here is superb, keeping the shots tight and using 3D at the right time to accentuate the intensity of what's going on while also keeping what you're watching dynamic. Each character has their own fighting style that really fits who they are. Kurisu, being a traditional samurai, moves with elegance and purpose, not wasting any swing of his sword. Kibito, being the most rational, gets help from his comrades and uses guns to handle the Kabaneri from a distance. These two don't have the flashiest ways of fighting, but it works since they were trained more to protect the Yame rather than fight Kabaneri. The Kabaneri are a whole other story. Ikuma, being an engineer turned into one, is new to combat, so he's up close and personal using his piercing gun, but is very messy, usually taking lots of battle damage and getting bit. Mume, being the most experienced, is fast, agile, and precise, constantly moving using the force of her guns to propel her away from the Kabaneri as well as keep her speed. Kinda like a cool Ruby Rose. There are only 4 fighters in the show, but it did a great job at making each one unique enough that it kept the fights interesting throughout its whole run. I would love to see the number expand in the future just to see what other creativity they can think of when it comes to combat, because Ikuma and Mume are only scratching the surface of what's possible. The action is a definite highlight, but when accompanied with the music takes it to a whole other level. Being done by the amazing Hiroyuki Sawano, who most know him for his work on Attack on Titan, Guilty Crown, and Gundam Unicorn, but for me, his Studio Trigger work is his best stuff, with Kill la Kill and the most recent Promare. And now I think it's time to address the Titan-sized elephant in the room, and that is its relation to Attack on Titan. Aside from being the same studio, it has the exact same core staff behind it, from its 3D, sound, and main directors, to its music as I just mentioned, to even its producer. Obviously, with the amount of shared DNA, its tone feels very reminiscent to it, and has made many see this as a ripoff or clone to its older brother, which I completely disagree on. I'm not gonna say that there wasn't some inspiration from it, but it feels more like they looked at Attack on Titan and decided to make a series that is everything it isn't. For example, everyone comes from different backgrounds, giving them unique fighting styles, purposes, and designs. While in Attack on Titan, it's a military force, so everyone is a fighter trained in the same way and they all have the same uniform. One has the last bits of humanity behind walls, keeping the threat at bay. The other has different societies constantly moving, with the possibility of them finding the threat rather than it finding them. Attack on Titan has massive humanoid creatures that can eat people in one bite, while Kabaneri has hordes of normal-sized zombies that can infect people. I can be here all day comparing every little thing about the two, but I think you get my point. Ripoff for Clone says that there are some glaring similarities between two objects, but Kabaneri does the opposite of everything Attack on Titan. If one thing is the opposite to another, doesn't that mean they're nothing alike? So how can this show be a ripoff for Clone? Saying it's like Attack on Titan is like saying that Fire Force and Promare are the same since both are about supernatural firefighters. Or that Kakegurui is the same to Kaiji Ultimate Survivor since they're both about gambling. I honestly feel that people just saw Mumei's fighting style and the gas canisters on her back and called it a day without ever actually watching it. I did the same for the longest time and was pleasantly surprised when I gave it a chance. It being the opposite in every way to Attack on Titan also means that sadly its writing is easily the weakest part of the show. As much as I enjoyed the characters, we never see who they are outside of fighting Kabane, which is a real disappointment because the few brief glimpses we have of that really add a lot to them. They're exactly the characters we see at the start without ever being fleshed out, making them pretty basic. For example, Ikuma is a young boy who lost everything to a supernatural force at a young age, and has now dedicated the rest of his life to wiping it out so it never happens to anyone else. I know that sounds like a certain someone, but when I watched it, my brain immediately went to Shinra Kusakabe from Fire Force, which I think stresses my point even more. I think it's okay to use tropes and archetypes as a basis for characters as long as you add traits and ideas on top of that to give them a personality. It's why these two feel completely different even though they have the same backstory and motivation. I always found Ikuma the most interesting when he was with Takumi because we see a whole other side of him. Anime bromances are one of my favorite things due to how fun they are since the two parties get each other so well. It's very implied that these two have a history of studying Kabane and experimenting with weapons in their free time, so it's a real shame that we didn't get more of these two in its runtime. Takumi is easily the most entertaining of the cast since he has the most normal reactions to everything going on. But the best character is Mumei since she's the most interesting with her duality of being a sweet young girl and efficient killing machine being presented really well, and how it's tied to the plot of season 1. She's basically the mascot of the series and it makes a lot of sense why since she has the most going on compared to everyone else. The other problems with the story are kinda spoilery, so I can't really go into detail about them, but I'll try my best in explaining them. As I talked about earlier, the Kabane are one of the best things in the show since every encounter is always different. But there is a point where a new threat is introduced and I honestly feel like the show jumped the shark to a point that I couldn't get behind it even on my rewatch. A lot of people don't have a problem with it, and even some of my favorite moments in the anime happen because of it, so this is something you'll have to decide for yourself and I don't want to take that away. Finally, if anyone has seen Kabaneri, you'll know what my last issue is, and that is its villain. Again, I don't want to go too much into it, but I'll just say I was never able to believe his motivation. And how he's used in the narrative actually negatively affects some of the other characters in ways that I'm still not happy about. This may come as a surprise since it's the same staff as Attack on Titan down to even the scriptwriter, and that show is pretty solid. This is pure speculation, but I feel this team works better at adapting material rather than making their own, which is why the writing is the weakest link here, and I think that's okay. At a time where they were mainly known for a really well done adaptation, for their follow-up they decided to do something completely their own, and I think more people should be giving them credit for this. Original anime is something we need to see more of in the industry, and I'll gladly give respect to anyone trying something new and failing rather than doing something safe yet successful, and for their first attempt they did a really solid job. I don't want to sound like I'm excusing its flaws with arbitrary reasons, since these are flaws that do affect it, and even knowing what I do now from making this video, it still hasn't changed my feelings. But I do want to recognize that, like the show itself, they decided to take a big risk and got rewarded with a series with a ton of personality they can call all their own, which lines up with the studio's other originals. The Rolling Girls was actually their first one, and funny enough, a lot of the criticism that I have for Kabaneri I also hear for this one, that the writing is weak while everything else is great. The reason I bring it up is that they apparently keep improving with each entry, based on the critical reception, leading up to their most recent anime, The Great Pretender, being universally praised, which I've been very excited about ever since I first heard about it and eagerly await watching it whenever I get the time. The other reason I bring these shows up is to present how visually distinct they are from each other, each one being just as unique as the last that you can tell where their passion lies. It's most likely the reason they're focusing more on original series, and based on what I saw in Kabaneri, I can't wait to check them all out old and new. It's also why I'm really excited for the upcoming Vampire in the Garden and Moonrise, both slated for 2021. But I think it's time to get back to the main point of this video. The show is definitely something special, which is why it really saddens me that it never gained any traction, because I feel like it would have gotten better as it continued. I say this because of its follow-up movie, Kabaneri of the Iron Fortress: The Battle of Unato, that takes place 6 months after it ended. It's just more Kabaneri, with the same issues we've talked about, just a little more ironed out. The movie may not look like a total upgrade, but I think that's more of a testament to how amazing the anime looks. Where you really see that is in the animation that completely tops what came before, making it a solid sequel in my opinion. But after that, there isn't anything else except the mobile game, and it's just as lackluster as it sounds. It did have an opening done by Wit Studio, so it looks amazing, and it also fleshes out a lot of the concepts from the anime, with new characters in it that were actually done by Haruhiko Mikomoto, so they're all fantastic with the same level of personality as the original cast. In some of the concept art I found, it seemed like they were putting a lot of thought into their backstories, like how Haya looks weak and scared here in front of a man with his fingers broken and face covered in blood. It's possible that the man was tortured in front of her and now she's looking at the people who did it. Or was she part of another faction and did Ikuma's group just find her? In this one it showed the little girl being eaten by Kabaneri, so it's most likely a flashback for one of the characters. Here we see Chihiro, Kaname, and Haya teaming up, and in the opening you see them have a great dynamic with Kohime, the Princess of Mikawa included, another new character. So there's definitely a bit of a history between them. In the last one it's Yatori. From her design she's definitely not a fighter and is for sure more of an expert on the train, possibly being a leader of another group that joins them. Her piece, while there is way less to go off of, with the snow backdrop and lighting, it looks like she may be trying to convince others to join her, as if she's their last hope. This is just pure speculation, but there's a lot to chew off from the few pieces of art I was able to find. You can actually see them all have unique weapons in the concept art and opening, that it looks like the staff lean more into the creative combat I was talking about earlier, having this trench knife gun combo with 2 modes to switch between that can't be used at the same time to fit the situation. Haya actually has a different type of gun as we see here and in her character sheet. Chihiro looks like he has a sniper rifle, so he's probably the inventor of the group, which is why they all have unique weapons. Even their canisters are different, Haya's being singular, Chihiro being completely new, while Kaname has the standard one we've seen before. If we look through more, this girl has something that looks like a fishing rod. We never see it used in the opening, so how it functions is still unknown. There's even a new character that I've never seen before who uses this spear weapon. Outside of the characters, the concept art for the world is insane, where you see a lot more society than how they've changed from the Kabaneri but not being in ruins, showing that the beauty of life can still exist in a world trying to extinguish it. Each section tells its own part of a story, from finding a small shelter in the first one to Mume with some of the kids telling Kaname about it. The second is them exploring it, with Kaname bargaining with this parts broker and his assistant, to Mume with someone else going to a local food stall. The last one being them accepted and taking part of a traditional festival. Another one shows an entire city living under the cliff of a mountain, which may be how they've been able to hide and build it how it is. There's another city that has your standard layout we've seen before, but in a more arctic environment. There's even some art that shows how they would have evolved the Kabaneri, the first being a hive that transforms based on the creatures of the environment, to a different mutation, and even another hive that transforms into a completely new form with a character facing it. Wit Studio poured their heart and soul into this, which is crazy since it's just a game for your phone. You can tell they're super passionate about it, that it's depressing the anime having continued. It's a starting point that would have gotten more interesting as it progresses. It honestly feels like it was starting to hit its stride after the anime, since you really see what it's capable of in the movie and especially in the mobile game. The movie came out in 2019, so there's still a chance for it to return, and if it does, I hope it reuses a lot of the assets on display here since they're just too good to leave on a phone game. The series overall is definitely flawed, but despite that, I don't think it should be overlooked since it really stands out once you give it a chance. It has an incredible amount of potential that I would love to see realized in the future, but until then, I'll patiently await the day I can see Ikuma, Mume, and the rest of the gang again, because when that day comes, I know there won't be anything else like it, and that's something special.